Welcome back to State of the Nation. Fewer than 10 weeks of Labour being in charge and the great Brexit betrayal is already underway. Government sources have briefed the Times that ministers are willing to give ground on a youth mobility scheme that would give young EU citizens the right to work in the UK. And that could be thousands of them. If this happens, it is merely the first of many steps towards bringing us back under the yoke of the European Union. One of the key reasons for leaving the European Union was a rejection of mass migration, and today some legal migration figures came out that showed the last Conservative government's policies were beginning to work. So a move like this would represent a betrayal of one of the greatest democratic exercises in British history. But government sources picked the wrong day to brief the papers about this signal that the UK is moving back into alignment with Europe. You'll hear the clock striking in the background. As you know, Somerset time is a few minutes behind Greenwich Mean Time. So you may have seen the deeply encouraging news that the United Kingdom has approved lecanemab, the first ever Alzheimer's drug that has been shown to slow cognitive decline by about 27%. The United States has approved the drug too, but lo and behold, the European Union has rejected this drug owing to concerns about side effects. Its ever-present precautionary principle means that people can't get life-saving treatments that will make their standard of living, their experience in old age, so much better. Why, when people are suffering from Alzheimer's, would the EU not allow patients who would be well informed of the side effects to at least try a new drug that is the first to be shown to delay some symptoms? Because the European Union is an overly regulated and overly risk-averse institution, which we're lucky to be out of. Sir Keir Starmer, whether he pursues a youth mobility agreement or not, clearly wants to pursue closer ties with the EU. But this decision from the EU regulator is a microcosm for why the Prime Minister should not look to align further with the European Union. And the question arises whether this Alzheimer's drug will be available in Northern Ireland, which is compulsory aligned with the European Union. The EU prides itself on its high level of regulatory interference, which it pursues regardless of the consequences. In reality, what it does is to stifle economic growth, which lowers everyone's standard of living. Compare the size of the US and EU economies over recent years. In 2010, both economies were roughly the same size, about $15 trillion in GDP. But nearly 15 years later, the EU economy has barely grown to $18 trillion, while the US economy has steamed ahead to $23 trillion. This gap ought to tell the Prime Minister everything he needs to know. The future of British prosperity does not lie with the EU, but with the United States and the Pacific. Not only should he resist any temptation to implement a youth mobility scheme, but he should focus on alignment with the serious economies overseas to unleash Britain's economy and improve living standards for all. As ever, let me know your views via mailmog@gbnews.com. But with me now is the GB News senior political commentator, Nigel Nelson. Nigel, welcome. Thank you for joining me as usual on a Thursday. Normally I see you in person, but today we're remote. This is Labour trying to get back into the EU by stealth, isn't it?
No, not even nearly. First of all, the youth mobility scheme doesn't look as if it's going to happen. That the usual sort of weaselly, ambiguous Whitehall words are no plans. In fact, the government have gone further than that and said they're not even considering it, which is a bit more concrete. The idea at the moment is to get obviously closer ties with Europe, but when it comes down to young people, it's things like making school trips easier, student exchanges, cultural visits, that kind of thing. However, I think that they should have a youth mobility scheme. We've got it with several other countries. It works very well. There's no reason not to do it. It has nothing to do with the idea of going back to freedom of movement.
But we've got it with other countries like Australia, where the numbers coming will be similar in either direction. The thing about the EU is that the population is so much larger in the EU than here that it will be disproportionately EU nationals coming to the UK. And so many people voted to leave because they wanted to control migration. And this is a classic thin end of the wedge.
Well, people who come here would need to have a job to come to. If they want to volunteer, they need an organisation to go and do it. So it's not open-ended. And it's not just places like Australia, New Zealand, Canada. We've also got similar arrangements with Uruguay, with Japan, with South Korea. They work perfectly well. Our young people can go over there. How much better for young people to go to Europe? If you want to train as a barista in Spain, for instance, and learn how to make coffee, learn the skill, then come back here.
Well, I would have thought because simply the numbers, and that we've seen this before, that the Home Office, when we opened up EU free movement in the early 2000s, said it would only be a few thousand people, and then hundreds of thousands, eventually millions came, which we couldn't even count. When we offered the right of residency to EU member state nationals when we left the European Union, I think there ended up being 6 million of them, many, many more, millions more than had been forecast.
Yeah, but this is not free movement. This has got nothing to do with free movement. What we're talking about here is a visa lasting 3 years. Then these people will go home. They have to pay the NHS surcharge to come here, have to have several £1,000s in savings. They can't bring family. So it's time limited, and there's no question they would get settled status once they come here.
Well, we've seen that before, though, haven't we, that people come here for a short time. We've seen this with students who come and end up staying well beyond the time they're meant to and then enter the illegal market. So I'm not convinced that this will be run efficiently by the Home Office, which has no record of running immigration schemes competently.
Well, that's a different argument. If people actually overstay, then they're committing an offence.
It's the same thing. That if you open it up so that more people can come and you just think, oh, they will go, that is showing an enormous naivety. And I would argue that it isn't naivety. They know perfectly well that people will stay and they don't mind because Labour likes mass migration. It is part of its fundamental policy and it wants to get back to it by stealth. And when you said at the beginning that they've promised not to, they promised that there wasn't a black hole, and then they said as soon as they got into government that there was a black hole. So you can't trust a word they say.
Well, the black hole is a completely different area, which I'm sure we're coming on to. When it comes to this, anybody coming into Heathrow Airport can overstay their welcome. So either you ban all visitors from Britain just in case they stay longer than they should, or you accept that these schemes actually work and can be for the benefit both of this country and other countries.
Well, thank you, Nigel. I hope to see you personally next week. But with me now is today's holder of the State of the Nation flabellum, the great Stanley Johnson. Stanley, do you think this is the thin end of the wedge?
I don't. I listened to the debate you've just had with Nigel Nelson. And I've got to tell you, I agreed very much with what Nigel said. Of course, you could say, I hear tonight as someone who's just followed Marco Polo. Marco Polo was the great bridge builder, the historic bridge builder. Yes, of course, bridge building is in my bones. In this particular case, I'm with Nigel Nelson because what are we talking about? We're talking about building links for youth. We've already, I think, pursued the Horizon scheme. The question is whether we will go down the Erasmus route. I would say that this has nothing to do with mass migration. I support him very much on that. I'd go further, as a matter of fact, and without saying we're revisiting the whole European debate. As you know, I was a Remainer. I very much thought it was a mistake to leave. As a matter of fact, if you look at the current polling by, I think, YouGov last night, they said 59% of the people they tested would
but almost all the polls before we left said people wanted to stay. So I treat the polling with some caution.
Right, but coming back to this one, I would say this is a natural. It's a winner. We should do it. I go further, and I've been arguing for some time that on key issues like some of these scientific issues, environment would be one of them. Years ago, when I was a fonctionnaire in Brussels, and then later on I became an MEP. I wrote the rules for the European Environment Agency. All the time we were in the European Union, we were part of the European Environment Agency. I wrote an article in there which said non-EU countries must be members, and they are. There are several non-EU countries. So this bridge building thing, I think, is absolutely crucial. Your point is that it holds back growth. First, I don't regard growth as being necessarily a good thing automatically under all circumstances. Growth is depending on how fast your population rises. If your population doesn't rise...
You need GDP per capita growth, not just GDP growth, and that we've been getting GDP growth, but actually it's been shrinking in GDP per capita terms because of mass migration.
Agree with you totally on that. My line is if you want GDP capita growth, then the sensible thing is to control the capita.
That's right, that's right. And this is where I'm worried about this proposal. Because
yes, I see your point.
The British voter is now very fed up with mass migration, that they feel they've been taken for granted. And the governments, including Conservative governments, have promised to reduce migration and they haven't. You then get a new government that comes in and it says we're going to be very tough and we're going to deport people. And then it says quietly, and then we're going to up a new scheme that allows tens of thousands of people to come. I think this is just disrespectful to voters who have asked the government to do something else, and the government has implied it will do something else.
Well, what you say is basically right, in the sense that politicians, including Conservative politicians, made some very clear pledges. I go back to when you were elected in 2010, you were elected with the Cameron government. As I recall, Cameron said tens of thousands.
Right.
That was his target. We are so far away from tens of thousands, it's laughable.
And so that, I think, is very important.
Yeah,
if we were close to tens of thousands, then fair enough to say, for all the arguments you give, that we want to have cultural exchanges, we will open it up a little and we'll allow some more young people to come. When you've had 1.4 million in 2 years, legal migrants, then you're taking people for granted, aren't you, when you suddenly come up with a new route that makes it easier for them to come in?
All right. Well, I suppose what I would say on this particular scheme, I would say you need to be very, very careful just to make it clear that these are, as it were, student exchange schemes. Student exchange. And yes, your point about the imbalance is a good one, and we would need to be sure that 10,000 Brits doesn't mean 28,000 coming in.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, thank you very much to Stanley and Nigel.